So we're picking up back on last week's poem. So what was the poem talking about? First of all, where did we leave off line-wise? Do you guys remember? I remember we agreed to revisit it. What's that?
Eight, right?
I couldn't hear
There's
you.
8, right? Like the one with his feet being shot is where we left off.
Okay, so we left off on this. So what was the theme so far that we had? We had a couple different themes showing through so far.
What's the fun called again?
Oh, this is called God's Grandeur. This was for week. This was for week 11. God's Grandeur by Gerard Hopkins.
I thought we were on line 9 or 10.
What's that?
I thought we were on line 9 or 10.
Yeah, we were. So, but what did we say so far? What was the poem talking about up to now? You could get the poem back up. It's a good way to jog your memory. What did the poem start with?
We talked about like how cool the world is.
So yeah, it started with how cool the world is. I like that. Basically, yeah. So like God's grandeur in nature, right? Very common theme. Okay, and then there's this transition. You guys remember this is where you get this weird thing where the sentence doesn't end until the next line and then becomes the opening thought.
Yep.
You guys remember this? So what was the transition that we saw coming through that moment? What did it transition to? What was our second theme?
It's like, so it starts off with like how awesome nature is or whatever, and then it goes into like how man abuses it.
Yeah. So we've moved from that moment of basically looking at the grandeur of nature to men, in essence, crushing nature, right? It's us being removed from it. This was the image of the bare feet, right? Shod feet versus bare feet, right? That like at one moment we would have, been connected to the earth. Now we're often very disconnected, right? And then there's some of these other, there's these other images, right? It's sheared by trade. And what was that? Seared by trade. What's the image here? What does it mean to be seared? Anybody here likes to eat tuna?
Like burned.
Yeah, it's blackened, right? It's seared. Why by trade? What's the image here? Seared by trade. This is where we were kind of starting to get into the context of the poem. When was this poem written?
Just like back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right?
Yeah. So what was going on economically in that time? People know what was happening in the late 1800s?
Mining. The first industrial revolution.
Yeah.
The first industrial revolution, right? Our author is in England during the first industrial revolution, the place that initially sort of kicks off the industrial revolution, right? So we're thinking about within that context of what he's looking at, what do you think seared by trade probably means? What's searing the landscape?
Maybe roads.
Maybe roads.
Kind of destroying natural resources.
Yeah, and so the rest of these are going to be kind of like moments of, right, the image here is very much so one in which we're seeing sort of the natural world being sort of decimated. I thought, seared it being the image of fire, my mind went to factories, and like you think about like you see images from the 19th century, particularly in like northern parts of England, and basically like the whole city becomes sort of covered in ash. right? With this constant smoke cloud, right? It changed so much that like I remember in high school we read this piece, and I don't remember the name of it because now we're talking like 30 years ago, not quite 20 years ago. But anyways, like you had like butterflies actually changed colors. The recessive genes actually changed where they were no longer going to be bright colored, they became gray colored in essence, so that they could blend in. Because essentially like the animals would only eat the bright colored ones because everything had been turned gray. Right, so you think about the impact on the natural world of something like that, right? Very visible, it's seared by trade. Smeared with toil, right? This is like, you think about like, sort of like something more like mining, right? Like, popped into my mind, has anybody here from like a mountain area of the country? Where are you from?
I'm from Colorado.
You're from Colorado. Did they do the mountaintop removal stuff in Colorado?
I don't know.
Probably. You would probably know if they did.
Yeah.
So I spent a while in Tennessee and Virginia, and like literally like there's this thing where they'll like literally take piece by piece a mountain down and mine it. So like literally it'll be like a mountain, and then like even like things like in national parks they sell off their mountains, and like they literally just like take them down all the way down. If there's a protected thing, this is something that like local populations complain about. So like if you had a graveyard on the mountain, they would just cut down it so it became like a pillar, and then eventually it'd fall over, and then they wouldn't have to be like blamed for disturbing it. They wouldn't have it, right? But basically like the idea is that you like quite literally they just like chunk it down. And you think about like what does that look like when you drive past it, right? What does it feel like? Like it's very different from a mountain, right? It's smeared, right? It's smeared by toil. And then we had that, it wears man's smudge and shares his smell, right? So you think about like, any images pop into people's head for that?
Like how the tanneries would have a wretched smell.
Anyone else? Everybody drive past something that smells really bad in terms of like industry kind of thing?
The yeast factory thing down here.
What's that?
I mean, the like little factory thing, like where the like with the yeast here in
Oh,
town.
the till? I think
Yeah.
that smells okay.
No, I drove past that last night and I was like, ugh. It was just a little too much. It was a little overwhelming.
Yeah, just saying.
It was like just a lot of bread.
Nobody here's from Erie, Indiana, are they? Has anybody ever driven through Erie?
Garrett?
Yeah, sorry, Gary. Yeah, Gary, Indiana.
I've driven through Gary.
What's that?
Yeah.
Nobody here's from Gary? What does
I'm
it,
not from Gary,
did,
but I've driven
did
through
you notice the smell of Gary?
I just know Gary's not a very nice city. There's always horrible traffic right in that part of Indiana.
Yeah, there is. The kids.
No matter what time of day or what day you're going, it's just always horrible.
It's a city on the outskirts of Chicago, and it's basically like the industrial center in a lot of ways for Chicago is Gary. And you drive through it, and the whole town literally smells like sulfur, right? So it smells like rotten eggs, like all the way through it, right? Like you think about that, right? Like so, how all the ways in which we take this very glorious thing and then turn it into something that's actually in a lot of ways a reflection of us, right? Which is not a positive statement, right? And yeah, and then we have a new verse, right? What's our next verse? What does it start with?
The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod.
Oh, yeah. So now the soil's bare, it's torn up, it's right, nor can we feel it because we wear things, right? Which is the image that we picked up on last time before we left. Right? Okay, so then we get a whole new verse. What's our new verse start with? And so this is getting a sort of tension in the poem. What's our new verse starting with?
And for all this, nature is never spent.
Yeah. So the idea is like, on the one hand, right? So this is like when we got, if you think back to our discussion of the stewardship idea, right? You know, it's this sort of balance between being utterly acritical of something and being hypercritical is kind of like one of the points. And I think that's what's one of the reasons why the poem was picked, right? Is this draws this sort of tension, right? Like in some ways we never actually destroy like God's glory in the universe. Yet we certainly try. Right? We certainly obscure it, obfuscate it, you know, destroy a good chunk of nature, right? And these things have their impact. So like the way in which we abuse this sort of gift, and the other thing about stewardship is using resources well. And we don't do that, right? We don't use things well. We can identify that, right? But that doesn't, like, we still don't get to destroy it, right? In the way of like destroying God's glory in it, right? Like, so there's this tension here. And I think that's kind of the idea of the poem. Any thoughts on the poem? Final thoughts people have on that as an idea? Do you guys see the theme here and how it's being employed? Great. So let's go ahead and move to the one for this week. I think we'll get caught up this week. Okay, so what's our new value for this week? Who's finishing on? What's that? Stability. So how do we? So just somebody to read the first line again.
We believe in a commitment to one's vocation and a daily rhythm of life following St. Benedict and St. Scholastica, to develop a balanced way of life and one for the people and place along with fidelity to its traditions.
So, do you guys know what this is referencing? And this is sort of throughout here. And we see it in the habit of mind too to some degree. Does anybody know what's different about the Benedictine order than some other orders? In terms of the way monasteries work? Yeah, they stay in one place. Does anybody know what that's called? They're referred to as cenobites. So the monks here are cenobite monks, right? They're not hermits. They don't cloister away from everybody else, right? They're not Menicans. They don't wander around evangelizing. They stay in one community, right? And so like quite literally, you know, when I first came here to visit, I was talking to a monk because like when I interviewed, I stayed in the monastery because they have. By the way, when you guys' relatives come, if they haven't, like they can just stay in the monastery. Or I don't think they can right now. Under normal conditions, they can, right? But when I was staying in the monastery, one of the monks was talking about that every morning he wakes up and looks out and sees the place he's going to be buried. Like there's something kind of neat about that, right? But it shows like this like connection to your place, right? So this sort of intimate knowledge, a closeness at a time, right? And so that's kind of the value of stability here, right? Putting it over that sort of like adventurers go out versus like being completely closed off and away from the world, right? So this sort of balance. Okay, what's our habit of mind?
Managing impulsivity through discernment and recollection.
Through discernment. So what is it meaning by these things? So impulsivity, discernment, recollection.
Not making rash decisions.
Not making rash decisions.
Don't be stupid.
I think the
Make good
recollection
choices.
I think the recollection part is keeping in mind what you have to do or your mission. So
how does impulsivity play into I guess like our thought worlds as, you know, scholars here at an institution where we learn.
I think impulsivity in that kind of sense is like doing one thing over another. It's like doing what you want to do before doing what you actually have to do. That could be impulsive in a way, like you have an impulse to, I don't know, go to Walmart or, you know, go for a walk rather than doing your schoolwork. I don't know.
So it could be just following your desires. Something else that the prompt here is indicating.
Here's one thing for what it's worth, just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah.
But counterpoint, is there a time to be impulsive? Because think about it.
Yeah.
Wisdom in your teens would not be that much fun, not gonna lie. Like there's definitely a time where I look back and I'm like, yeah, I'm glad I was impulsive and did something a little bit stupid. You know?
Like, I know, right, but I,
Yeah.
because when I saw impulsive at first, I was like, oh, like, this is sweet and stuff. And it was like, don't be impulsive. And I was like, oh, okay.
Well, but notice there's a even if we were just to take the title, there's a phrase. What comes before impulsive?
Managing.
It's not avoid impulsivity, it's manage it, right? So like, in the answer, like, I think that there is a moment to be impulsive, but there's a good thing to manage your impulsivity. I think that that's kind of like thinking about it as a balance. I think when we look into like also like what is it meaning here? So if we take that first full paragraph here, and talking about learning, and there's this halfway through the paragraph it says today. Do you guys see where I'm at? Somebody want to pick up from there?
Today, powerful social forces seek to replace considered reflection with almost instinctive reactions. In economics, consumers are conditioned to purchase without careful thought. In politics, voters are urged to react emotionally and angrily. In the intellectual life, ideas are reduced to popular or unpopular slogans. In each of these examples, an immediate response seems to be demanded.
Okay. Yeah. So what's being indicated here?
I think that, and this is something that my dad has, sorry, my phone was buzzing. This is something that my dad has said. He's a businessman. But something that he's always said is that in today's world, with all of this technology, all of this, you know, you can literally get anything you want at your fingertips. I'm sorry, I'm looking at all of the things that we want are at our fingertips. So when we have to stop and think about something, we're not getting it right away, and that it's that instant gratification that we as a society are so used to, that when we have to actually stop, wait, and think about something, it becomes very difficult to deal with.
Yeah, we live in a world, and so like what's being indicated here is we live in a world where impulsivity is a value, right? But like, you know, and it's a value like in this case, right? Like, as consumers, you're pushed into being impulsive, right? Impulse buying, right? Rather than carefully weighing out what's good or bad about what you buy. And we're all kind of guilty of this, right? In politics, right? Emotional reactions to things. I mean, you think about like what's going on. Like, are you guys familiar with the political polarization stuff that's going on right now, right? And you get things like quite literally, like you get like social media trolls, right? You guys heard this term before? You guys know what trolls are?
Yes.
They're basically people who just get riled up, right? There's not really a lot of truth value to what's said in terms of like, and you got to be very careful about like what you're consuming when you look through, because this is the thing about advertising, nobody thinks it works, but it does. Like, companies wouldn't advertise and try to push you into impulsive decision making if it didn't work, right? Like, like advertising is like one of the biggest industries in the world. Why is that? It's because it works. So all of us are actually affected by it, even though you'll rarely come across somebody who's like, oh yeah, if I see a commercial, bam, I go out and buy it. Like everyone says, oh, I see them, but they don't really work on me, right? If everybody who said it didn't work on them, then we wouldn't ever see an advertisement, because it would be horribly, it'd be a horrible waste of resources, right? Same thing with like in terms of like thinking about politics and like trolls, right? Like they utilize our emotions, right? They get us to think unreflexively, and they heighten differences basically for political ends. And this happens on both sides, right? So this isn't a party line thing. But people become further and further away, and it's largely out of this sort of impulsiveness rather than even-mindedness of trying to figure out, right, what needs to be done in the world. And also, like in intellectual life, and I definitely feel this, and if anybody here thinking about going into, I guess, like being a scholar professionally? Anyone here interested in like going on in college? Like what you'll find is it is very fad-like, and I find myself even like explaining things like why I teach some of the things I do in classes. I'm like, well, this is really popular right now, right? And it's true, like it does, like, oh, this idea, or like even if it's like kind of like the canon, I'll be like, well, this was, for sociology, the canon's not that old. But anyways, for the sociological canon, I'm always like, well, this was really popular in the 50s. Right? Or, oh, this is really popular in the 70s. And so like in a lot of ways, like it is sort of like this weird, like, popularity contest about ideas, right? And so all that sort of forces us into sort of this quick, immediate reaction that we kind of like lose any sort of like of the softer, slower reflection. Right, and so this is basically what our prompt today is kind of trying to get us to think about, is the need for that, right? The need to essentially like do these things that take a while, if you will, right? And you think about like does anybody find it hard to read if your mind's really active? Has anybody ever experienced this? Like, what times do you guys do readings for your classes, usually?
Right before.
Which, that's a good example. Like, that would be a very built-on impulsive, like, instinctive kind of way of trying to learn. What might actually be a good way to read? If you're really wanting to absorb something, what might be a good thing to do? I often refer to myself as a professional reader. I think that's actually what I went into. Basically, I figured out like reading, like it's like, other than maybe watching TV for a living, like it's the most relaxing thing you can do for money. Anyways, what would be a good way of reading if you wanted to reflect upon the things you're reading for classes?
When you're in the right mood.
Yeah, what does that mean? What is the right mood?
Not about to fall asleep.
Yeah.
I feel like it's always mine. I'm like, oh, alright, my brain's kind of broken from physics. I'm really tired, I'm gonna read this.
You really hate physics, don't you? Every day you're like, physics.
An argument could be made.
Yeah. If you think about it, like the best space is if you get into sort of like a quiet space where you don't feel rushed. Like that's really kind of the way to do it. Like I like to do a lot of my reading over coffee in the morning. I probably read half of the things that I read before 7 o'clock in the morning. But I get up really early. But anyways, like that's a sort of, what's that?
Before 7 o'clock?
I get up at like 5 in the morning.
So do I.
Yeah.
What?
I get up at 5. I make a French press of coffee, and then I sit there until like 7 o'clock doing. That's when I do almost all my prep for classes. Is like right away in the morning, like that. In a recliner, right? Like, but seriously, like if you want to like really kind of like reflect on something, being in this sort of quiet space where you feel comfortable. I'm a big believer in working horizontal rather than vertical.
What?
Oh, yeah.
Horizontal.
So like, yeah, like leaning
Like
back.
sleeping?
No, you don't want to work when you're sleeping, but you know, like get chill. Yeah, get comfy.
What?
Seriously, like if you're gonna like sit and try to absorb things, like you don't want to feel rushed. Like, you know, if you're sitting here and you're like, you're not gonna absorb very much. It's gonna go in it's gonna go in through your eyes and out through the back of your
I have
head.
a theory that with our whole like fight or flight thing, if you can get enough adrenaline pumping, then your brain kicks into that like, oh my gosh, I've got to be like paying attention to what's going on, and then you remember more. So that's why when you're standing the night before, you're like, oh my gosh, and so then your brain's like,
But that kind of gets back to like, do you remember metacognition week?
yeah.
Like that's really good if you're just like memorizing phrases on a flashcard. It's really bad if you're, I don't know, trying to like, you know, I don't know, like absorb some like difficult philosophy or something like that, right? Okay, so how do we see this idea popping up in the video we watched? So this was the Lost Memories. Supposedly you've all watched it 3 times. I felt really nostalgic. I haven't watched anything on Vimeo since I used to be a judge for a film festival for quite a few years. And I was like, I feel like I'm doing this again. Anyways, so what happens in the video? What is the video about? Did people watch the video?
The guy puts, instead of putting his attention on the lady, he puts his attention on everyone, on the crowd's reaction to their relationship. He puts his attention on his phone instead of on her, and he regrets it.
Did you have more to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that it's like, well, like all the pictures and videos get like wiped out in like this electromagnetic storm thing, and like he realizes they don't actually like have anything left. Like it's kind of all based on something impermanent.
And how? Anyone else want to add details from the? I mean, it's a 2.5-minute video, so I think that maybe is the details. So how do we see our theme for this week? Right, playing around in that. Both the stability and the managing our impulsivity. Besides the fact that it does kind of feel like the video feels a little to me like old men talking about young people on their phones. Just a little. But beyond that, getting outside that, because you can be productive.
With like the stability of it, because part of that was like developing a balanced way of life with the love for people and a place, is like he wasn't like developing that like love for a person or for like the place that they were at, because I mean like they were in front of like the Eiffel Tower, like, you know, like that was like a moment to just stop and like take it in, and instead he immediately turned his back towards it, like everything, including her, and then like was on his phone because like had to like keep up with like going to the next thing.
Yeah. Anyone else? How else do we see it? Has anybody ever like been on vacation with somebody who's kind of like that?
Yes.
It did definitely remind me of that.
Like, instead of actually watching the thing happen, taking a video and watching it through the phone.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people, their vacations become like just going to photo ops.
Yeah.
An endless stream of photo ops. I personally, when I travel, I like to stay in one place the whole time. It's the only way you get to. What's that?
That does not sound like traveling.
Sounds like vacation.
No.
I'm always
That just
down.
sounds like moving.
Well, no. Like you know, like if you're gonna like be someplace for 2 weeks, don't just like skirt around. Like stay, right? Like pick one city, airdrop in, And then by the end of 2 weeks, you know, like 15 people in town, and you're like, you know, you had a good time, and then like, you know, you feel like you got the rhythm of life there. I don't know. This may be very anthropological of me. Like, I want a slice of life rather than. But anyways, right, like, yeah, getting back to the idea, right, he's distracted by these sort of like ephemeral, it feels very much so like that, right, in the video. It's very like flitty around kind of feeling, right, like with this, I don't know, futuristic giant telephone in the air, basically. And, you know, obviously has more social media than exists currently in our world. But anyways, the point is basically this idea of like the silencing of the more important things in terms of, right? Okay. Any final thoughts before we close up shop for the day? Well, great. Thank you guys very much.